So today, I titled the sermon, Smell of Truth. We started a few weeks back with the voice of truth, then the sight of truth, the taste of truth, now the smell of truth. My kids were wondering how many possible other topics there could be. This is probably the last one. So, the smell of truth, and we are in Daniel 3 today. Last week when we talked about the taste of truth, it was related to the Israelites as they were journeying to the promised land, and God was feeding them manna and being able to trust that God was going to take care of all they needed, that the taste of the food, the manna that they were eating, was God really going to do what he said he would do. Today, when we pick up with the smell of truth, we are in the book of Daniel, and this is further along in the history of the Israelites. So they were journeying to the promised land. They made it to the promised land, and we are so far along in their history where they were actually taken from the promised land, and that's where we pick up in our story. Some of the Israelites were taken captive by the kingdom of Babylon. And the Babylonian king was Nebuchadnezzar. It's a pretty long word. It's not a normal, English name, but that was his name. He didn't speak English. King Nebuchadnezzar. And we're picking up in Daniel 3, right at the very beginning of the chapter. It says, King Nebuchadnezzar made a gold statue, 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide, and set it up. Then he sent messages to the high officers and all the provincial officials to come to the dedication of the statue. So all these officials came and stood before the statue King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So think of a giant statue, 90 feet tall, 9 feet wide. Calls all of the important people to come to the dedication of this statue. Let's keep going. Now we're still in Daniel 3, but verses 4 through 6. It says, Then a herald shouted out, People of all races and nations and languages, listen to the king's command. When you hear the sound of the horn and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will immediately be thrown into a blazing furnace. So he calls all the important people to come to the dedication of this statue. And it wasn't just a, hey, look how great this statue is. It was, you're going to bow down and worship now. When you hear all these instruments, you're going to bow down and worship. And if you don't, you're going to be thrown into a blazing furnace. This is a common story taught in Sunday school or children's church, so a lot of us have heard this at different points in our lives. So it's not a new story, maybe, for a lot of us. And we've heard this part before. They have to bow down, and if they don't, they're going to be thrown into a blazing furnace. Now, at the time, there were some Israelites in Babylon. Like I said, they had been taken captive, but we're still in the story. This is verse 7. It said, So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people, whatever their race or nation or language, bowed to the ground and worshiped the gold statue that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. So it must have been a common thing. You just did what the king said. You didn't want to make him mad. You didn't want to be thrown into a blazing furnace. So he says, I'm playing music. You bow down and worship. They played the music. All the people that were there, all the different representations of tribes and races, all bowed down to this statue. But if you're familiar with the story, there are some people who didn't. Now we're in verse 8 and through verse 11. It says, Some astrologers went to the king and informed on the Jews. So that means they went and tattled. The Jews were doing something they shouldn't have been doing, and so they went and told on them. They said to King Nebuchadnezzar, Long live the king. You issued a decree requiring all the people to bow down and worship the gold statue when they hear the sound of the musical instruments. That decree also states that those who refuse to obey must be thrown into a blazing furnace. So they go back to the king and remind him of his decree. I don't really think that would be something he would forget. Oh yeah, I did say that. He told the people, when you hear the music, you bow down and worship. So these people went and were tattling on the Jews. Now we're in verse 12. they're still talking, and they say, "But there are some Jews, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, whom you have put in charge of the province of Babylon." So these were 3 Jewish boys who had been taken to Babylon when Israel was captured, and they were doing a good job. They were in charge. They'd actually been put in charge of stuff. But the king said, "Bow down," and they didn't, and now they're getting told on. Probably these people were jealous that these foreigners had been given some type of authority and the ability to rule, so they were tattling. They continue, they say, "They pay no attention to you, your majesty. They refuse to serve your gods and do not worship the gold statue you have set up." So they were expected, because they were in Babylon, they were expected to be worshiping the gods there, doing everything the king said. And I mean, he had put them in charge, so they probably did a pretty good job of obeying certain things, or he wouldn't have put them in charge. But now it comes time for this, when they're supposed to bow down. It says, "Then Nebuchadnezzar flew into a rage and ordered that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be brought before him." So he gets pretty mad. Obviously cared about them enough to put them in charge of stuff, but now hears that they're not obeying, and he gets mad. He wants to see them so he can hash this out. We're in verses 14 through 15. The king said to them, "Is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you refuse to serve my gods or to worship the gold statue I have set up? I will give you one more chance to bow down and worship the statue I have made when you hear the sound of the musical instruments." So he calls them in, and he's mad, and he said, "Is it true that you're not doing what I want you to do? You don't worship my gods. You're not bowing down to this statue." He's reminding them, "I said this. Why are you not listening?" And he says, "I will give you one more chance. When you hear the music, you better bow down." He keeps talking, and he says, "But if you refuse, you will be thrown immediately into the blazing furnace. And then what God will be able to rescue you from my power?" So he says, "I'm giving you one more chance." And he reminds them what's going to happen if they don't obey. If you don't bow down, you're going to be thrown into the furnace. And then what God's going to save you? Because he's mad they're not worshiping his gods. He's mad they're not bowing down to his statue. And he's calling them out. So you don't want to obey me? You get one more chance. And if not, you're going in the furnace. Let's hear what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said. It said, they replied, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty." I like how they say, we don't need to defend ourselves. If you want to throw us into the furnace, our God will take care of us. Our God can rescue us. Is that the kind of faith we have when we are facing something bad? And chances are we're not facing being thrown into a fiery furnace, but we face bad things. When we face something bad, do we have the faith, do we have the courage to take God at who he is and stand upon his word and say, my God will take care of me? We fear so many of the what ifs and the unknowns and the things that are coming. But do we have the kind of faith to say, I don't care what is coming. I don't care what is happening next. My God can rescue me. We live so much in the fear of the what if. They were facing imminent, like thrown into a fiery furnace. We spend so much time trapped in fear, and we don't even necessarily know what's coming next. They knew what was coming. They knew they were going to be thrown into the furnace. And they said, our God can rescue us from your power, your majesty. I like how they throw on the your majesty at the end. God can rescue us, your majesty. It's like a subtle, passive, aggressive defiance of the king. Do what you want. Our God will rescue us. We keep going. Daniel 3:18. the three boys are still talking, and they say, but even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. Even if God doesn't save us from this fire, we are never changing our minds. Do we have that kind of faith? So often when we're facing something bad or something bad happens and we know that God could make it all better in a minute, do we still have that kind of faith that says, no matter what, I am not changing my mind. I'm not backstepping. I'm not denying my faith in God. I'm not turning around or changing what I believe. They had enough faith in God that even if he didn't rescue them from that fire, they weren't going to step back. They weren't going to backtrack. They weren't going to bow down. They didn't love their lives so much that they were going to turn on God. Is that how we are? Do we have enough faith that when God says, I have good plans for you, that my ways are higher than your ways, do we believe that he really is good? And even when we're facing a blazing furnace, that no matter what, he's still God. And no matter what happens, we're going to cling to him. Even if he doesn't, we will never serve your gods. Verses 19 through 20. Nebuchadnezzar was so furious with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that his face became distorted with rage. Picture that for a minute. There are certain people, when they get mad, it seems like their head is going to blow up. That's kind of what I imagine here. He was so upset, his face distorted with rage. He commanded that the furnace be heated 7 times hotter than usual, like he wanted to burn them even more. So mad that they had the audacity to say, no matter what, even if he doesn't, we will never serve your gods. We will never bow to your statue. Heated the furnace 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered some of the strongest men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and throw them into the blazing furnace. King Nebuchadnezzar didn't back down either. He said, you don't bow to my statue, you're going in the furnace, and by the way, it's hotter than normal. He has them bound up, so it's easier to throw, I'm assuming. Verses 21 through 22. So they tied them up and threw them into the furnace, fully dressed in their pants, turbans, robes, and other garments. And because the king, in his anger, had demanded such a hot fire in the furnace, the flames killed the soldiers as they threw the 3 men in. Fully clothed in all the clothing of the time, wrapped up in ropes. The flames were so hot that the soldiers that threw them in died. They were thrown in. Sometimes we think that as Christians we shouldn't ever go through anything bad. But you live long enough and you know that's not the case. God doesn't say, become a Christian and everything's easy. I'll save you from every blazing furnace there ever is. They were thrown in. They had all their clothes on. They were wrapped up, and the flames were so hot that the men throwing them in died. That's crazy. So, this is verse 23. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, securely tied, fell into the roaring flames. If the story stopped here, it'd be pretty sad. But that's not how our God works. These 3 men, fully clothed, thrown into a fire so hot that the guys who threw them in just are laying there dead. Verse 24, it says, but suddenly Nebuchadnezzar jumped up in amazement and exclaimed to his advisors, didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them into the furnace? Yes, your majesty, we certainly did, they replied. Didn't we tie up 3 guys? Why is Nebuchadnezzar asking this? So he can see somehow, what's in this furnace? Like through the open door or whatever they threw the guys in. Didn't we tie up 3 guys? Look, Nebuchadnezzar shouted. We're in verse 25. Look, I see 4 men, unbound, walking around in the fire unharmed. And the 4th looks like a god. So they go in with all their clothes on. The guys who threw them in are already dead. They are walking around in this blazing hot furnace, no longer tied up, and someone else is with them. And Nebuchadnezzar says, and the 4th looks like a god. This is one of those times in the Old Testament where Jesus, scholars would say this is Jesus coming before he was incarnate and going in there and being God like he always was and always will be and always is. 4 men unbound walking around in the fire unharmed, and the 4th looks like a god. So the 3 men were thrown in. They still went through the bad thing. They still went in the blazing hot fire. And God was right there with them. That's the promise that we have. The promise that we have isn't that our lives will be perfect, nothing bad will ever happen, we never need to be, no. The promise is when the bad things happen, God is with us. He is in the fire with us. He is working with us. That our God will rescue us. Let's keep going. Verse 26. Then Nebuchadnezzar came as close as he could to the door of the flaming furnace and shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire. That's pretty crazy. They get thrown into something that was so hot, the soldiers died throwing them in. They were tied by really strong, the strongest men of the army, and yet they walk out of the fire. They walk out of the fire. Verse 27, then the high officers, officials, governors, and advisors crowded around them and saw that the fire had not touched them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothing was not scorched. They didn't even smell of smoke. And that is the smell of truth. When we go through all the bad stuff that we go through, our God will save us and rescue us and be with us every time. They didn't even smell of smoke. You go by a regular bonfire for less than 30 seconds and you smell of smoke. They were in a blazing furnace. They come out, no smell of smoke. That is the smell of truth, that our God is with us no matter what. And our God will be with us no matter what. And when the bad things happen, he is still with us, walking around in the fire, untied. They come out. They didn't even smell of smoke. Their hair was fine. Their clothes were fine. All the things we expected to be just obliterated from the heat of the fire, everything was fine. They went through the bad thing and they were not destroyed. They were not crushed. God saved them like he always does. Verse 28. Then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He sent his angel to rescue his servants who trusted in him. They defied the king's command and were willing to die rather than serve or worship any god except their own God. Is that how we are too? Are we willing to defy what shouldn't seemingly be defied? They were put on the spot. You have one last chance. I'm playing the music. You bow down or into the fire. And they said, we will never serve your gods. I want that kind of faith in God, to take him at his word, say, bring it on. My God will rescue me. You throw me into that fire, he's going to rescue me. But even if he doesn't, I'm never bowing down. Because God has promised that he will take care of us. Maybe it's not a rescue that we think. We can come up with great ideas for the best way for God to do something. But God said, my ways are higher. God always has a better plan, a bigger plan. God is always working, even when we can't see it. That is the smell of truth. So I ask us today, what are we smelling Have we been in the fire and we've come out and realized we don't even smell of smoke? Do we believe that God will do everything he said he will do? Who are we trusting? Can we take God at his word? Can we take him at his word when we say, even if God doesn't respond the way I think he should respond or move in the way I think he should move? Am I going to cling to God no matter what? No matter what. God, you are the one we trust. You are the one we trust, God. Forgive us when we forget who you are, that you will never fail, that you will always be with us, that you are the great King of Kings, and yet you sent Jesus for us, and that we can cry out to you and call upon you, and you are always there. Thank you for loving us so much, God. Be with us this week, that our hearts would be drawn to you, that we would want you more and more and more, God, that you would use us to make a difference for your kingdom. And we ask these things in your name. And all the people said, amen.